668 pages of utter perfection. Hello, I'm Kavya from Kavya the Bibliophile, and today I'm going to be talking to you lovely people about the magnificent Lady Midnight by the talented Cassandra Clare. For those of you who don't know, Cassandra Clare is a young adult author most popularly known for her young adult urban fantasy series called The Mortal Instruments, which is kind of part of a bigger series called The Shadowhunter Chronicles, and she is also currently co-authoring the Magisterium series with Holly Black. Now, Lady Midnight is the first novel in the Dark Artifices trilogy, and it follows the story of Emma Carstairs, who we first met in City of Heavenly Fire when she was 12 years old. She is now 17, and she is searching for her parents' murderer while living with the Blackthornes in the Los Angeles Institute because her Parvati, Julian Blackthorne, lives there. So the rest of this video is going to be very spoilery, and I would definitely suggest that if you haven't read the book, you don't stick around, because you don't want spoilers for any book, obviously, but with this one, there's so much that goes on that if you get spoilers, it'll ruin everything, and you don't want that. So if you haven't read the book, go read it, come back, join us, and we can all discuss together about our lovely thoughts and opinions and emotions that we got from Lady Midnight. If you have read the book, let's get started. We first start this novel off at the Shadow Market in 2012 with Kit and Johnny Rook. This prologue is told somewhat in Kit's point of view, and I say somewhat because it's written in third person, meaning it uses she, he, they pronouns as opposed to I, we, us. However, from what I understand, I believe it's written in third person omniscient as opposed to third person limited, and third person omniscient is described as having an all-knowing God, so really it's saying that although it is written in third person, you can still see into the characters' minds the same way you would be able to see into one with a first-person novel. As someone who has personally experienced the difficulties of writing in third-person omniscient, I have a great deal of respect for any book that has been successfully written in that point of view, but that's also just a personal preference of mine, and it's also a difficulty that only I may face. I know that my favorite point of view to read is third-person omniscient, but that may not be for everybody, so that's a personal preference. On top of that, this novel takes place in the Shadow World, and we're kind of familiar with it now because there have been 9 or 10 books written in this world previously. I really enjoyed that aspect of the book because although it was a fantasy world, it wasn't as much discovering the world. And I do enjoy discovering and experiencing everything for the first time and new, but the only time you really feel familiar and comfortable with the world is more in contemporary novels because they take place in the real world. But to already have that familiarity with the fantasy novel was something I enjoyed because it was nice to have that kind of refreshing change as opposed to having to discover everything new. That being said, there were so many new aspects to this novel and to the world that we didn't know about beforehand. So I think overall it had a nice balance of both familiarity and having all these new parts to the novel and new parts to the world and to the characters that we didn't know beforehand. The characters as well, we had met many of them in City of Heavenly Fire, such as Emma Carstairs and all the Blackthorne siblings. Although they were much younger at the time, it wasn't as new and it wasn't, again, all discovering everything about the characters. But there was so much to discover. You got to learn more about them and what made them who they are. And then there were new characters such as Christina, Malcolm Fade, Diana Rayburn, who were introduced in this novel as well. Because there was some familiarity and some feelings of being comfortable, there was so much space for plot to be in this book that it didn't really feel like a first novel because you weren't just discovering the big bad evil, you were also hunting it, and you ended up killing it by the end. So that was, again, something so new and refreshing, and it didn't feel as much like a first novel, but it still felt new. Those are all very generic aspects of the novel, so now I'm going to get more into the specifics of the characters I liked and didn't like, the plot events, and all that jazz. Let's go! As I said earlier, we first started off this novel at the Shadow Market in 2012, with Kit and Johnny Rook being the first characters we were introduced to. I didn't really form any opinions of either of them initially, I thought that this was the only part of the book they were going to be in. The biggest surprise to me was that they were both mundanes, from what we understood at that point in time, who actually knew about the shadow world and were involved in it, because I didn't think it was as common for people with the sight to really be involved with the shadow world. Maybe I missed something in the earlier books, but I just didn't think it was common. As the prologue continues, we meet Emma Carstairs and her boyfriend Cameron Ashdown, who have come to Johnny Rook to try to find information about murders that have recently occurred, because Emma is trying to tie the murders to the murders of her parents. My initial reaction at this point was kind of what? Because I didn't expect plot to happen all that soon. I didn't expect to be introduced to the main character in the prologue itself. I don't know why I didn't expect that, but that's just how I felt. And then we go to the first chapter, which is A Sepulture in This Kingdom. We start off this chapter with Emma breaking up with her boyfriend Cameron, and then we soon get introduced to Christina, who is an 18-year-old shadow hunter visiting the Los Angeles Institute from Mexico City. My initial opinions of both Emma and Christina were really good off the bat. Emma is snarky, sarcastic, badass, everything you could possibly want in a protagonist, and I just really enjoyed reading about her and reading that whole sarcastic side from the protagonist itself, because I feel like it's always the other main character who is generally the sarcastic one, but in this dynamic, the leading female character was, which I enjoyed. Christina, on the other hand, is kind of a nice balance between that fiery side and that mellow side. She doesn't fit into one category specifically, which I enjoyed, and I also enjoyed that although she was a side character, there was so much depth and there was so much to her herself. She had an entire secret coming from her family back in Mexico and her life back in Mexico. On that note, another aspect I really enjoyed is that she was from Mexico, she wasn't an American, and I truly enjoy when books include minorities and diversity, whether it be races, religion, gender, sexuality, anything. I think that that one gives you more relatability with readers on a wider basis. It's also just really good because the world isn't one way and there isn't just one group of people living here. I think Cassandra Clare does a really good job about that. She's had LGBT characters. She even played on religion by having a Jewish character in the Mortal Instruments. And overall, I think she does a relatively good job of including more minorities than some other books I've read, which I, personally, as a reader, truly enjoy. We're then introduced to Diana Rayburn, the tutor of the Blackthorne family. I have very mixed opinions about her, which I will get onto later in the review, because I think more about her is revealed then, although not much about her is actually revealed in this novel. The first big plot event to occur now is that Emma and Christina find a murdered fae. Because of the dark war that occurred previously, the fairies were helping Sebastian, who was the antagonist at that time, so there's currently a cold peace going on, meaning that the fairies don't have a good relationship with the rest of the shadow world, particularly the shadow hunters themselves. And shadow hunters are basically not allowed to interact with fairies in any way, shape, or form. They aren't allowed to help them or anything. The only shadow hunters that really are the Silent Brothers and the Scholomance and Centurion. So, of course, Emma's not really supposed to do anything, so she just calls the Silent Brothers. And the biggest part of this is that the murdered fae has the same markings on their body that Emma's parents did when they were murdered, and Emma's parents' murder was classified as murdered by Sebastian by the Clave, who are the government of the shadow world, which Emma doesn't agree with, and most of the people she ends up working with in this novel don't agree with either. We then proceed to chapter 2, called Neither the Angels in Heaven, where Emma is showing Christina her wall of crazy, as Julian refers to it, or wall of proof, as Christina eventually refers to it. The wall of crazy is a wall in Emma's closet where she has filled it with proof of her parents' murder and clues as to who murdered them. She has even stolen pictures from the consul's office, the consul being the highest official of the Clave, kind of similar to a president or a prime minister, depending on where you live. And she adds on the information she has found that day to it. The rest of this chapter continues to introduce us to the Blackthorns. The ones we're introduced to in this chapter being Julian, Tiberius, Livy, Drusilla, and Octavian. Julian is Emma's Parabatai, and he is also 17 as she is, and he is definitely the more mellow, artistic, quiet one in the dynamic between the two, which again I thought was interesting because that's usually not the dynamic, and I enjoyed that. Julian has had somewhat of a difficult life. He had to kill his own father, and he's basically raised his siblings the past 5 or so years and taken care of the Institute the past 5 or so years ever since their father's death. Tiberius and Livy are both 15 years old. They're twins. Tiberius is very different compared to other shadow hunters. He doesn't want to be the type that fights. He wants to grow up to join the Scholomance. I truly enjoyed his character because he was so different from the rest, and there was so much depth to him and his story, and I thought that that was something so interesting. Livy is his twin who wants to be his Parabatai, but because Tai wants to join the Scholomance, they are at odds about that. Then there's Drusilla, who is 13 years old and obsessed with horror movies, and Octavian, or Tavi, who is 7 years old, and I think they come more to prominence later on in the novel, and that's something I truly enjoyed, that all the siblings really contributed to the story as a whole, and as it went on they contributed more and more, and each of them became more prominent. And the other Blackthorns are Mark Blackthorne, Helen Blackthorne, who are Julian's half-siblings, as they are half fairy, half shadow hunter, meaning that they're not in a very good place because of the cold peace. Then there's Arthur Blackthorne, Julian's uncle, who is supposedly taking care of the Institute. I've gone into a lot of detail about the first 2 chapters and the prologue because they're the introduction where we really learn what's going on and we got introduced to the majority of the characters. But now I'm just going to talk more about the overall plot events and other new characters that are introduced later on in the novel, because I don't want to spend 5 minutes talking about each chapter, as that would make this review way too long and very boring. Because this story talks about the cold peace and includes characters such as Mark Blackthorne, who's half fairy, we learn a lot more about the fairy world, which we didn't know much about them in any of the previous books. We've never really met any significant fairy characters as we have with other downworlders such as Magnus Bane, a warlock, or Luke Garraway, Maya Roberts, who are both werewolves, Camille Belcourt, Raphael Santiago being vampires. But there were never really any significant fairy characters, although I suppose you could argue the Seelie Queen was one. But now in this, we discovered a lot more about the fairy world, the Seelie Court versus the Unseelie Court, the Wild Hunt, which was really interesting. I liked getting to know more about them. The most significant fairy characters we meet are Gwyn, the leader of the Wild Hunt, Kieran, the prince of the Unseelie Court and a member of the Wild Hunt, and Earlet, a member of the Wild Hunt who is actually working with the big bad of this novel. I didn't form too much of an opinion on Gwyn. He seemed nice but mean, so I wasn't really sure what to think at first because he seemed to have some sort of compassion, but he was still harsh overall. Kieran, on the other hand, I wasn't a big fan of, and I'm not really sure how I feel about him and Mark as they were dating, but he did come through for them in the end, but still, I don't know, I had mixed feelings about him. Earlet I wasn't a fan of from the beginning. He seemed like a real ass, and he just seemed really mean and jerky off the top, which made me initially not like him, and I don't think I was truly surprised to find out he was working with the big bad because of his behavior, but it wasn't something I was expecting. I wasn't thinking, oh, Earlet has to be working with the big bad, but I wasn't necessarily totally shocked and surprised by that revelation. The reintroduction of Mark Blackthorne is one of the first big plot events that occurs, and the Wild Hunt is returning Mark back to the Blackthorns because they want him to help them discover who is behind the murders, as the murders are affecting the Fae directly. They argue that if they succeed, they will give Mark the choice of whether to stay with his family or come back to the Wild Hunt. I must say that Mark's initial reaction and behavior was not what I expected. I was expecting him to be really excited and joyful to be home, but he seemed totally confused and out of whack with the good purpose, of course. But the first person that could really get through to him was Christina, as they didn't know each other beforehand, and he was mostly confused because his siblings were now all grown up, and over in Fairy World, time was definitely different than what was going on here. Then there's the dynamic between Emma and Jules, or Julian, who are Parabatai, meaning that their hearts beat as one in battle. I enjoyed the Parabatai being the main characters of the novel, as opposed to Julian having a Parabatai such as Tiberius or, say, Christina. I enjoyed that Emma herself, the protagonist, had a Parabatai because I think that that gave us more insight to the bond and how it really worked. That being said, their relationship is definitely more complicated considering the fact that they're in love with each other. I thought it was really interesting that they ended up having sex in the first novel as opposed to building the tension and them ultimately getting together in the second or third novel. Then arose the issue of the Parabatai curse, which Jem told Emma about. I was really confused as to why Emma didn't just talk to Julian, instead faking a relationship with Mark, because I understand that something being forbidden makes you want it more, but even so, Julian seems like a responsible individual, and communication is key, but I don't think Shadowhunters are very good at communicating with each other. But aside from the relationship drama, there is a lot more that happens in this book. There's the action and the mystery aspect of it, and the first real mystery we're introduced to is Emma is trying to discover who murdered her parents and why they murdered them. Ultimately, Emma's parents' murder actually ended up being insignificant to the antagonist and his journey, and really it was a much bigger story than Emma's parents being murdered. It was something that involved the Blackthorns directly. The antagonist of the novel was Malcolm Fade, a warlock who was actually friends with the Blackthorns, which made him being the big bad something really unexpected, because he seemed like a nice guy who was slightly out of it, but overall a nice guy who was a powerful warlock. Yet he ended up actually being the big bad because he was in love with the Blackthorn years ago, but Downworlder Shadowhunter relationships are forbidden, and they ended up murdering the Shadowhunter, Annabelle Blackthorne. And that's actually how the novel got its name, because Annabelle Blackthorne was known as the Lady Midnight in a children's poem, and Octavian actually discovered that fact, which I really enjoyed because that gave him more prominence as a character. Another surprising aspect is that Malcolm wasn't necessarily all bad. He was just crazy in love, trying to resurrect the person he loved, and he thought everyone was lying to him, which was not the case at all. But he wasn't such a bad guy trying to make a race of demon shadow hunters or something. He was just in love, and he was handling it very, very badly. Another interesting aspect is that Malcolm was already killed in this first novel by Emma, as opposed to him being the big bad and dragged out through the other two novels, which is what I expected after we discovered the big bad. But yet he was killed in this first novel. There are definitely a lot more questions to be answered, such as the why lie situation that happens at the very end, and Diana's secrets and all of that, but I definitely thought that the antagonist would not die in this first novel itself. Aside from the discovery of Malcolm being the antagonist and the discovery of the Blackthorne family secret with Annabelle Blackthorne being murdered years ago and the connection to the Poe poem with Annabelle Lee, there was a whole lot of Shadowhunter issues going on at this point. When I say Shadowhunter issues, I basically mean issues concerning the Shadowhunter characters or something. One of the biggest new aspects to this world we discover are the Scholomance and the Centurion, who were only brought back after the Dark War and when the Cold Peace was started. The member of the Centurion we meet is actually Diego, or Perfect Diego, who is connected to Christina, as he is the boy she was in love with, and his brother James was her best friend. So this is where Christina's big secret comes in, where she had a very bad falling out with them, and well, it wasn't really a falling out because they didn't know anything that happened, but she overheard a conversation between them when James was drunk, where he was talking about getting power and such, and he didn't really love Christina or anything, but Diego insists that he wasn't really in on this, it was James' idea, he actually loved her. I'm not sure that I believe him, because his character does seem slightly iffy, we don't know much about him, and I'm not sure how I feel about the him and Christina situation, although I'm not sure about my Mark opinions. I do think I prefer him and Christina as opposed to Diego and Christina or Kieran and Mark. Then, as I mentioned earlier, Jules is basically running the Institute. His uncle, Arthur Blackthorne, is out of it, one of the terms used to describe him being mad. I can't say I was necessarily surprised or shocked by the revelation that Jules was running the Institute, because from the beginning there did seem to be something off about Arthur, as he was described as immersing himself in classic literature, and his conversations with Julian were somewhat clues to the fact that there was something deeper going on. It is revealed that Arthur and his brother Andrew, Julian's father, were tortured by fairies, and that's what made Arthur kind of lose it. Then, as the book finished, there were obviously a lot of questions raised, the biggest ones, in my opinion, being the Diana Rayburn situation, as there were many clues that there are secrets to her family and to her herself. I would like to discover more about the Arthur Blackthorne situation, because I do think there's more to his story, and I would love to know more about that. And then there was the revelation of Christopher Herondale, who is actually Kit, Johnny Rook's son. Now, I haven't read the Tales from the Shadowhunter Academy yet, so I didn't know anything about the Lost Herondale. I know that that's one of the short stories in it, though. So I was definitely surprised by that revelation. I think that this may have been the most surprising revelation to me, because I didn't even know that that was something that could possibly happen. And then, of course, there is the Why Lie situation, where Emma decides that she wants to fake date Mark, and Mark replies by saying, "Why lie? Why shouldn't we actually date?" And I was totally surprised. I didn't read this book right after it came out, but while I was on Twitter, I saw a lot of people saying "why lie," and I had no idea what that meant, but now I do, and yeah, it was definitely a cliffhanger. Overall, my opinions of this book are so good. I loved it. I would give it 5 out of 5 stars. Well, I did give it 5 out of 5 stars. And I might be slightly biased because this is by my favorite author and it's part of my favorite series. But I truly do believe it was well written. The plot played out really well. There was depth to the plot, depth to the characters. Everything played out perfectly. And although there was that familiarity with the novel, there was also the newness, and it didn't feel so much like a first novel, but there were still so many new aspects of the world to discover and of the characters to discover. I think that this novel just made all of us as readers closer to the world, and it reveals so much more about the world to us. I hope you guys liked this review/discussion. It was my first one, so I'd love to hear some feedback about what you'd like to see more of or less of, and of course, these are my opinions, so be sure to leave yours in the comments below. Did you agree with what I had to say? Did you disagree? If so, why? I'll definitely be checking and replying to them, and my link to my Goodreads will be in the description below as well, so if you'd like to check out my review there. It was written about an hour after I finished the novel, so it's a much more initial reaction to the novel as opposed to this one, and this one's definitely more in depth than that. My other links will be in the description below. If you're interested in checking out my Twitter or Instagram, feel free to do so. And if you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe so that you don't miss any new videos. That's about it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you all very soon, and yeah, have a great day or night wherever you are. Bye!